Great. So just so everyone knows, we are recording our meeting today. We're so excited to have you here. So welcome again to our next lecture as part of our summer 2020 redesign series. Today's lecture is Global River Systems Planning. And this is a co-hosted event by Friends of the Parks and Friends of the Chicago River. And we're just very excited to have all of you here with us today. I want to share our agenda really quick with everyone on the call. We're going to do this welcome and introduction. So that's where we are now. We'll do a quick overview about Friends of the Parks, sharing about the work of Friends of the Chicago River. Then we'll jump into our lecture. And then we have a lot of time today for questions and discussion. We have this Zoom room until 1:30. So I'd love for you to stay with us as long as you're able to engage in dialogue. And then we'll do some quick announcements at the end of the presentation. So I'm so excited that you all are here. I'm Reverend Rachel Burkhan-Raumelfanger, the Policy and Advocacy Director at Friends of the Parks, one of the hosts of our event today. And I'll share the housekeeping before I share a little bit more about Friends of the Parks is please try to remain muted while you're on the event today, but you can of course unmute yourself during the Q&A or discussion portion. You may write questions or comments in the chat at any time. We love having a vibrant chat. Encourage you to keep introducing yourself in the chat. If you have a technology need, there's a problem happening, please message Julie Malnick, who can try to help you with that problem. And just a note again that today's presentation will be recorded and you'll be able to view it after the event. So again, Reverend Rachel Burkhan-Raumelfanger, the Policy and Advocacy Director with Friends of the Parks. And Friends of the Parks' mission is to inspire, equip, and mobilize a diverse Chicago to ensure an equitable park system for a healthy Chicago. And we do that with connecting with helping to advocate for the over 600 parks that are here in the city. And that of course includes some parks along the river. So we're very excited with this redesign series to be talking about how we can reimagine and re-explore our parks and our river and their connection to each other. We offer this Netsch lecture series as a way to engage with innovative ideas, public policy, environmental issues that affect our city in the spirit of Walter Netsch, who is a landscape architect, a professor, and a president of the Chicago Park District. And so we're really excited for this series this summer where we're really looking at how we might redesign our spaces. And so today looking at the river. And at Friends of the Parks, we've engaged quite a bit with the river because of all the parks that are being built along the river, right? As the river walk, as new development, we want to see the river as a second playground or sort of new lakefront for the city that creates new green spaces. And there are questions about how that planning and design happens. There's questions about how we develop those parks, and that's where we kind of have our interest. Particularly this last year, there's been increased questions about that planning and interest with the Bally's Casino coming up on the river, with questions longer term with Lincoln Yards, which has been a place where Friends of the Parks has continued to engage because of our advocacy around the North Branch Park and Preserve. And so we just continue to ask those questions about what does it mean to have green space along our river? How do we develop that as we ask those same questions about other parts of the city? But we partnered today for this conversation about rivers with Friends of the Chicago River because some of these policy issues are really more of their area of expertise and they engage a little bit more than us. And so I'm going to hand it over to our colleagues from Friends of the Chicago River, Adam, to introduce himself and share a little bit about the work that they do.
All right, thank you, Rachel, and welcome everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm Adam Flickinger. I'm the planning director for Friends of the Chicago River. And I just wanted to thank again Friends of the Parks for this partnership and kind of putting a spotlight on river-related issues because it's kind of at the top of many people's heads, and there's a lot of discussion happening right now because with all the changes that have occurred, there's growing, interest and pressure in developing and changing the riverfront. So we're excited to see that, but there's lots of things to think about. So I think this is a great time to have this conversation about innovation. So I'm going to start out, my work focused at Friends is on planning issues from many different scales. So we think about the watershed and the river corridor all the way down to individual sites and how those different scales interact with each other. So how intervention on a site or a change you might think of on local in your community is connected to that bigger picture watershed issue and how all those things interrelate. So that's why I'm excited for the conversation today, because Friends of the Chicago River is always interested in new ways to do things and new ways to think about innovative policies and ways to approach the future of the riverfront and thinking about land use and the vision and the next things we want to take on. So hearing about examples from around the globe and innovative ways to do things is always welcome, and we're always excited to learn about those things. But before we dive into that presentation from our guest, I just wanted to provide a little bit of context for the local efforts that Friends of the Chicago River works on here in our region to kind of give that local connection to the different examples we'll hear. So I'm going to share my screen for a minute. I have a few slides. And can somebody just give me a thumbs up if it looks good? All right, great. So in case you haven't heard of Friends of the Chicago River, our mission is to protect and improve the Chicago River system for people's plants and wildlife. And we're a nonprofit advocacy organization that was founded in 1979. One thing sometimes people don't understand is that we work across what we call the Chicago River system, which includes the Chicago River and the Calumet River systems, as well as their related canals and channels and all the tributary streams and creeks. That's about 156 miles of linear waterways, and it covers about 1,000 square miles of watershed across the region. So all the way up into Lake County, down to the southeast to the Indiana border, and out to the west to Lamont and Joliet. So that's a pretty diverse area. So it's not just the city of Chicago, it covers dozens of suburban communities as well. And we work we have a full-time staff of 15 people, and we kind of implement our vision with a suite of programs that are categorized into three different areas. First, we have education and outreach. So we have programs that you may have participated in as a volunteer, but we have our kind of annual cleanup day called Chicago River Day, which just had its 30th anniversary last year. And that happens at 78 sites across the watershed. We have a schools program that has done science education with youth. Many different things. We also have a museum down on the Riverwalk downtown where we have programming. And then we also do physical on the ground projects, which is the other category where we actually do landscape restoration. And we've done dozens of those types of projects across the watershed, many times with habitat restoration, invasive removal, over thousands of acres. So that's something we also focus on. And then the part of the organization that I'm connected to is the policy and planning team. And we focus on working with our government and agency partners about driving innovative policies and land use and development and providing technical expertise to property owners and things of that nature. So as many of you know, historically, the river was really neglected in Chicago, and there's been a complete transformation to today, of course, that we've seen from that kind of neglected, misunderstood, polluted thing to 43 or so years later, it becoming really one of the most visited, photographed, talked about, economically successful areas of the city, a complete transformation that many people would not have even imagined in 1979. The extent of it, it's also now a living place. And because of the improvements in water quality and the protection of the river edges and the improvements to natural areas and parks along the river, it's full of a pretty diverse array of biodiversity. Many endangered species use it and migratory species use it every year to cross through the region. One example or one statistic that we find kind of interesting is in 1979, when we were founded, there were only 5 species of fish in the river, and today there's 79 species of fish found. But that's not to say that there aren't still challenges, of course. So our work continues, and one of the things that is kind of increasing, as you all know, is the challenges presented with climate change and extreme weather patterns. Increased extreme storms are causing, additional polluted runoff and causing increased community flooding, and also it's putting at risk some of those investments that were made years ago in the improved water quality and the kind of stormwater infrastructure and things that help protect the river. So that's changing and increasing every year. So one thing that we're thinking about now is a way to conceptualize the way that we do our planning and policy work is this concept of the blue-green corridor vision. And that's a way that we think about how the success of the waterway is tied to the land and the banks and the watershed that surrounds it, and thinking about like how those different systems overlap between human needs and community needs, and also the needs of ecology and the environment. So it's kind of looking at overlapping systems, and at the core of it is really connectivity. So thinking about how connectivity happens for people, how people get access to the benefits of being able to enjoy nature and the environment, and then also connectivity from the point of view of wildlife as far as fragmented habitat needing to be connected up to provide that opportunity for successful populations and sustainability of that in the future. So the way that we kind of implement and move forward with that vision is at those many different scales that I referenced at the beginning. So thinking about at the micro scale, we do a lot of advocacy for development. So we connect, I saw a couple questions already in the chat about river edge developments. We really try to work with property owners and advocate for appropriate treatment to the river edge and give guidance on how to do that to support river-friendly design. And so we're always talking about creating that, that connectivity vision, thinking beyond your site and how the changes on your site affect the bigger picture in the river corridor as a whole. And that tying in that connectivity principles that are so critical with habitat connectivity and thinking about how wildlife use spaces that humans use and how that can be mutually beneficial. And then, so zooming out to the bigger picture in the watershed, we look at those systems more broadly and connect up what you're doing on your site to the broader watershed issues of open space protection and enhancement, and those larger scale green infrastructure issues of landscape restoration that's needed to also protect biodiversity and the health of our region from an air quality, water quality point of view. So those are the kind of different scales that we're working at right now and the type of work that we're focused on with planning. And I think it's completely relevant to the discussion today, because what we're going to be hearing about is kind of the ways that other regions are doing these things, but there's a lot of innovation. There's kind of this global movement talking about nature-based solutions and ecology and thinking about the next level of health of urban river systems. So I'm really excited to hear those kinds of inspiring ideas, and I'm looking forward to introducing our speaker to do that. So I will do that now. So I'm happy to introduce our guest speaker for the lecture, which is Dr. Şevin Yıldız. Dr. Yıldız is an assistant professor in the Urban Planning and Policy Department at the University of Illinois, Chicago, where she researches urban ecology and spatial planning in the context of climate change. She recently completed her book, which investigates the planning field's changing conceptualizations of fringe ecology, particularly in the New Jersey Meadowlands, which is part of the New York metro region. Her latest research looks at long-range planning and the transitory ecosystems called ecotones in Mumbai, Amsterdam, Tokyo, and New York. At UIC, she has been leading an ecological design studio, which I participated in a few times, very inspiring work. And that their projects are focused in the city of Chicago, and they're working on issues of climate adaptability, urban ecological planning, and infrastructure retrofitting. She also serves, as does Friends of the Chicago River, on the City of Chicago's River Ecology and Governance Task Force, which is a coalition of partners and stakeholders talking about river-related regulations and issues in the City of Chicago. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Yıldız to take us through our presentation.
Thank you for the introduction, Adam. I'm so happy and honored to be here. And I first want to thank you, Juanita and Rachel and Adam, for co-hosting this event and bringing my work to share it with you. It's really a pleasure for me to actually contribute to the ongoing discussion in Chicago. Having said that, as you heard from the introduction, I work on different ecologies in different parts of the world, and especially comparatively looking at them, which I think in this case, in the case of nature and environment, gives us this relative advantage because we have similar problems everywhere in the world, dealing with similar ecologies and our similar planning mistakes or planning approaches. But then we also have this capacity and opportunity to learn from each other. And that's basically the reason why this lecture is here today. I have deep respect and admiration for the work of Friends of the Parks and Friends of the Chicago River, because they are really on the front lines of these. And as you heard from both organizations, they have been advancing some of these ideas already and fighting some wars to try to change people's minds about how we look at rivers and their ecosystems. So what I'm going to show today is really maybe a provocation on further discussion of some of these ideas and some additions of how we can reconceptualize our understanding of the Chicago River system and its city. So, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. I'm open to questions in every and any topic. So, and also I am finally able to share my screen. We had a couple of problems earlier, but it is working now. So happy to do that. Okay. Well, the title of the lecture for today is Global River Systems Planning, and I will take you to several examples, mostly two very in-depth examples, and we can actually expand the discussion later in the discussion section from here. But what I want to focus in these examples is how they build identities, how they make contracts, and finally, a more provocative, maybe future realm is how we think about rights of nature. So it's kind of this conceptual framework or envelope that this lecture will take place in. Okay. Well, my personal commitment to the issue comes from a multi-stage, multi-pronged research. So as Adam was saying, in the design studios, independent studies, and in my own work, I do the exploration of Chicago River's integration into larger planning vision. That represents opportunities for us to push for new conceptual approaches in ecology, not just only in ecology, but also urban design and spatial planning, because right now they seem to have actually different tunes. And the future prospect for climate change is how we can actually integrate them in an intersectional and interdisciplinary way. The challenging nature has been here is looking at the river development through plans and guidelines. I'll come to that in a minute. But these plans and approaches, which is actually abundant in the city of Chicago since even 1980s, not just for advocacy or but actual concrete planning, they manifest changing approaches to urban nature. So maybe the question of this lecture is, are we ready for the next step? And what's the next step? How can we bring us to a larger, more encompassing vision that will both preserve communities, preserve ecosystems, but also prepare us for future failures of resiliency issues, right? Flooding and other issues. So flexible adaptation, urban risk accommodation, these are things that we have been thinking about in all our projects, in our studios and our independent researches. So that's basically my personal commitment to the issue. As I told you already, Chicago has an abundance of actually river area and community plans. They range in scale. Sometimes they are neighborhood based, sometimes they are citywide, sometimes they are vision for future like 2030, 2050. But we have many stakeholders that are invested in this process. And there are many documents lying around if you want to see how river has been seen and conceptualized in planning circles since 1980s. So there's no dearth of actually work that has been coming out. And then there are sectional plans, more specialized plans, so which may be focusing on just ecosystems, just parks, and just this and that. So we also have these specialized plans that have come out of different agencies, different coalitions in the Chicago River system, and that touches upon sometimes similar issues and sometimes divergent issues. Well, the confluence of all these spatial plans, and in my work, I've actually done the exploration of those to see like how they diverge and converge. What we see is like there is a continuous ecosystem approach, which is more emergent and recent, versus framed zones. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. In many older documentations and documents, Chicago River is considered a corridor, a river corridor. And I know that we actually alternately use this term between a system and a corridor. And for those of us who are in advocacy and river coalitions, they mean the same thing most of the time to us. But for outside of these coalitions, when you actually step out to the land of or the realm of development, urban development, they might actually show or signpost different things. So I'm here raising a question. Are we seeing the river as a corridor or a system? What's the difference? So hopefully we'll come back to this question after I show all my slides and might make my other sub points. But I think it's worth thinking like, what does a corridor imply? What does a system shift or change? So does language matter in this case? And what is evoked in people's minds, especially when it comes to legislation, and does it matter? So I think that's a valid question to ask. So in legal terms, a river corridor is actually a land area adjacent to a river that's required to accommodate slope, landform, buffer of the naturally stable channel. And also it's necessary for the natural maintenance or natural restoration of a dynamic equilibrium condition. So it's a legal definition of this. While it's mixed of both, right? It is the corridor, which is a channel and a river channel. And in most cases, we tend to think Chicago River as an industrial channel, an old industrial channel. But at the same time, the definition also has this expansion of natural restoration and dynamic equilibrium, which now is something that we discuss under the systems. Well, the systems versus the corridor approach has already also infiltrated into the other macro policy levels. Like here you have an EPA, basically explanation of a decree where Chicago area waterway system is defined as the Chicago River. So it is expanded to its tributaries and watershed, as Adam was saying, that we're interested in larger actually water bodies that are part of this system. So this system thinking has been in the works for some time now. But then we switch to what is actually current, and we have Chicago River design guidelines, which we also use in the studios as reference works. And then there we are more squeezed into a corridor approach, which means that there are all these regulations about right of way, setbacks, massing, and promenade width, all down to the dimensions of public spaces. But it actually limits us to look at the river as a corridor with additional public space. And this is something that we have been fighting of in the River Ecology Task Force with Juanita and Adam and some other people, saying that, well, let's switch to a broader expanded version of this. I mean, even 30-foot setback that's indicated in these design guidelines doesn't allow us to achieve some of the things we want to achieve with ecological restoration. So it's quite limiting. And again, this is where the development world and real estate world converges with the missions and aims of stakeholders and agencies like Friends of the Parks and Friends of the Chicago River. So this is an ongoing discussion behind doors in many different commissions. And as part of the coalition who pushes for a systems thinking, we have been undertaking this approach for a while. What does a system approach entail? And this is some work that we did in a studio years ago, 2 years ago, I think, or 3 years ago. And students looked at Chicago River as a larger river system of Illinois River, which then drains into the Mississippi, and then all the way into the Gulf region. So it is basically a nested system within a system, right? So when you think of river corridor descriptions, that is only limited to a certain extent and width, and then you put this more aerial bird's eye view connections, and then you say, well, no, we are actually missing out a lot of other interconnected issues and ecosystems that by just limiting ourselves to looking at it as a strip of development or a strip of restoration. So how do we relink some of these pieces? These are some of the questions we've tackled in our studios. How do you do relinking? If you want to expand the scope of the river corridor to a system, what do you actually have to add in? And one of the very conceptual approaches that the students developed, for example, last year was a concept that we borrowed from the EU river planning initiatives, which I'll come to in a minute, is by making room for the river. So does the river actually have to stay in its course? Can we expand more space for that? Does it have to follow the limits that were, somehow set by industrial expectations of 1800s? How can we expand our understanding of the limits of the river also? And this was a provocative conceptual thinking saying that, well, maybe the river doesn't have to be a channel. Like, how do we actually make more room? So these influences that we have in the studio, in our work, in our research, and in some of the discussions behind doors with the coalitions, actually also has a lot to do with what else is going on in the world. And here I'm going to show you one specific example from Germany, the Middle Germany. Some of you might be familiar with that, which is called the Amster region, Amster Valley, Amster River. They are actually coexisting identities. And overall, the region is known as the old mining region of Germany called Ruhr. And I will show you a couple of strategies of how they brought this huge region into a new identity by constructing certain steps and putting the Amster River at the heart of this reconstruction before that. But before that, I'll take just a minute and this is a seg into something else. Just recently, we had deadly floods in Pakistan, right? If you are from the region, if anyone is from the region, I'm sorry, because it's created so much human lives lost, animals lost, and ecosystems damaged and crops damaged, and created a huge crisis for Pakistan. This is an image from European Space Agency showing the extent of flooding of the Indus River. So another river that couldn't stay in the contained areas or the changes made by human beings overflowing. And in the CNN title here saying creating a wide inland lake. So it is making a room for its own. Whether we like it or not, it is there, and it's making its own room for expansion. It's just like a side note, but because it's so recent, I couldn't just help but also mention this. An unfortunate, loss of and damage to human lives here. But again, this shows us how the limitations we put, the boundaries, the strict boundaries we put on these natural entities, in most cases, go out of their track and follow their own logic of flow. So in here, it's a hydrological system finding new ways of, being absorbed by land, meeting the land, and other stuff. So going back to Amster, so my first example, it's at the heart of Germany. It's known as the kind of industrial heart of Germany. This is where it is. On the left, there's the Rhine River, the famous river that is also so important for transportation across countries. And then in the middle of this, which is not highlighted in this image, but in the next one, is the Amster River. And this entire area is known as Amster Valley or Ruhr district. And these names that you see here are the names of smaller cities and towns, from Essen to Duisburg, from Waltrop to Herten. So what is this river system, or a corridor, if you want to say that? It's a river system with neighboring towns. As you can see, many tributaries, but a main canal and a river that had been exhausted and abused for very different uses. And I can just say, like, this and you would understand the extent of pollution. It was used as an open sewage system during the heavy mining activities because they couldn't build underground infrastructure. Again, the ground stability of mining didn't allow them to actually run pipes. So they used the Amsher River as an open row sewage system. And the river actually lost so much during this time, during the stretch of 50 years, that as it was used as infrastructure. But then starting in the 70s, Germany started taking some steps back. So they started retracting coal production. You see the timeline of it, how they withdrew from coal production in the rural area, timed it and phased it out so that a new kind of future and a greener future could be in the picture. And here is 1989, the beginning of the Amsher Park project. I like this because it also says it's a park. And because this is a lecture that's hosted by Friends of the Parks and Friends of the River, I think there's no more like fitting example than Amsher Park story as a story of both the parks people and the river people working together to achieve a large scale regional goal. And as you see, 1989 is the beginning point. It's the reunification of East-West Berlin, right? It's a whole transition period politically too, but it's also, one could say, it shows us how long these projects take. It was started in 89, but when people started using it, it was just 2003, 4. So this vast amount of investment time just to clean up, prepare, renaturalize is something that in most cases development mindset cannot wait for. And this is something that, you know, I know that in the North Branch Park and Preserve project, both the River Friends of the Parks and Friends of the River try to share that with the larger Chicago community, saying that we need just time to invest. You'll see what the benefits are. So people don't believe in things that they don't immediately see the benefits of. And here, this is something, this exception, where the government, you know, stepped in and said, no, we'll phase it out and we'll give it enough time to renaturalize. So it's basically a 40, 50-year project, again, a long-range project that requires its own phasing, which also brings us back to the question, do we need some maybe longer periods of thinking for the river here too? They call it Amsher 3.0. And I like this quote because they say from gray to blue, how the blue sky over the rural region basically fell into the Amsher River. I like this idealization and also the conceptual change. And they call it the neglected backyard, from the neglected backyard to the showpiece front garden of a former mining area. As you see, the river identity here is quite strong. What I find with the Chicago River discussions outside of, again, stakeholders and coalitions is that it's just an amenity, it's an attribute, it is a resource, but it's never the identity. So it's this kind of maybe we have to turn this around, saying Chicago and its river, maybe it's a Chicago River metropolis or Chicago River region, right? So here, Amsher did that with 3.0 and turned this entire question upside down, saying, no, it's the river that gives its identity to the region, despite all these clusters of settlements and communities and towns, but we are holding that as central piece of the discussion. What did they do with the strategies? I'm sure that many of you would be interested in that. So first of all, as I told you, they built an entire regional identity, a metropolitan identity, a metropolis identity, which we equate with urbanization through the river. So it's called a regional Verband. It is basically a regional association of Ruhr, at the heart of which is the Amsher region. So they did not shy away from saying that a natural entity is giving us the metropolitan identity. In most cases, we think them as binaries, like if there is something urban, there's something unnatural, and then how can nature coexist with urban? Here, they've taken a couple of steps up and said, no, it's not just that, not coexistent, but it's actually the identity that's lending itself to the urbanization here in this region. So I like this very much. And then the second thing that they dealt with was converting industrial past and legacy into a natural entity. And this is something, again, we see a lot in the Chicago region, especially south part of the South Branch of the river, the Calumet region, we see them as some of them as post-industrial areas, and we think them as, again, counter intuitive to renaturalization. If they exist, they have to be cleaned up in the large quantities and scales. We cannot reuse them, and that requires, I mean, wherever past industry exists, it means pollution. Can you actually clean up without necessarily removing the remnants of industry? And here, that's what they did. So they renaturalized the riverbank regardless of land use in every section of the river corridor. And when we say renaturalize, as you can see, some of them even look random, unbuilt, no seawalls, no river walls, anything. It's just this combination of how nature will take over the industrial use. But it's also not a derelict site. I've been there myself. When you go to these structures, you seem like they're random and nature takes over. It's almost like a post-apocalyptic space. It is not. It's actually very carefully planned, and you find restrooms, you find access, you find everything. It's just for human beings to also coexist in the same environment. So the careful, I would say, curation of this, but allowing the nature to take its own course with the river, cleaned up river, and then debunking the notion of industry and nature coexisting, post-industry and nature. So parentheses here for the industrial natures is something that we also recently saw in Chicago in our own Wild Mile project in the North Branch. And this idea of industry and heavy pollution, and then you required extensive solutions, and if not, you can't use it. And the things that creates probably a lot of hesitation or funding, and then kind of scare of commitment for an invisible or unforeseeable future is something actually that we invent also. Here is an example of Spree River in Berlin, and where a group of coalitions wanted to start a movement saying you can actually go and swim in this canal, which was an industrial polluted canal. And similarly to wildlife, what they did here is they created a filtration system in the river with natural filtration system with plants and vegetations. So you basically drain and filter at the beginning upstream, and then downstream you can use that as a recreational amenity. And here is a technique that they developed just for this, as how naturally you can filter polluted water. So these all actually revolve around this idea of coexistence between urban and nature, coexistence between industrial and nature, and some of our distinctions and binaries between those two, which requires, I think, we actually have to bring the walls down between these silos. So another strategy that Amsterdam Park and River used was they made room for the river. This is a EU landscape and spatial planning initiatives. You actually can find a lot online about this. So EU directives asks a lot of countries, including Belgium and Netherlands and Germany, to decide about the future of their rivers, and this includes making room. And what does it mean? Allowing the water to flow in places that it naturally wants to flow. And they did this in many ways. They did rainwater infiltration and mixing with the actual river waters. Because of that, they had soft techniques and soft infrastructural strategies all across the valley to create these natural ponds, so that the hydrological flow of the system can reach into the deeper reaches. And it's irony, right? It's an ironic situation when you think of how Pakistan floods are said to create these inland lakes where rivers are reaching further inland. And then here, it's a more proactive way of thinking about it. Can we actually leave some room for overflow and for flooding? And that's the way to kind of think about it. So not always natural, though. So we also have to understand you sometimes have to create the conditions to reach an end product that in itself is an ecosystem and natural. In this case, I like this example because they basically constructed an artificial sea inland called Lake Phoenix. I think it comes from this whole notion of rising from the industrial ashes. And Lake Phoenix here is an artificial lake, but again, creating outlets for some of the underground tributaries that were buried down, and also creating a new zone for housing. So it's a mixed use area, but it's also an artificially created lake to make more room for the actual rivers underground tributaries. So that's a kind of a mixed strategy. It's a strategy of both blue and green infrastructure, but also a large-scale spatial planning. And that's where we actually see in the United States the divergence from spatial planning strategies. They have their own world and their own set of priorities, and then ecological constituents are trying to further their own agenda. So what's the middle ground to bring them all of these together? And as I said before, I'm interested in that. So Hampshire also created a lot of biotope stations, as you can see, and this is actually reminding me of what Adam showed with their work and the Friends of the River, creating hubs and links and creating ideas of natural reserve areas, but also active biotopes, which is basically ecosystems in different parts of the river system, which can be activated. And here, what Hampshire is called the ecological development centers, right? These highlights are ecological development centers. What Hampshire Park system did here was putting ordinances in place for each municipal entity. So each of these towns have their own adjusted ordinances to create or to shoulder this ecological biotope creation responsibility along the river system. So it's a regional vision that's trickling down to more local applications through ordinances in each municipality. And I think that's quite creative in seeing like how law and legislation can be used to further some of these ideas. And this is another way of looking at this belts and how they are bisecting it, how they're looking at the confluence of built up areas with the urban green wedges and how biotopes are created along the system. Another strategy they did in the whole park system is adding new zoning combinations and mixed use. So something, I think what developers or hardcore urban planners are afraid of when we say naturalization or renaturalization is that, oh, we've abandoned all the other urban land uses and no other thing. It's just nature taking over and doing its own thing. But here is another creative way of putting hospitality, a hotel function in the former wastewater treatment plant zone in the Hampshire Valley. And they use even the aesthetics of the grand pipes to go and fit with the language of the site and the legacy of the site. And these became like capsule hotels. So I'm actually planning on visiting it sometime, hopefully. But as you can see, these are single pods for overnight stays, and they take form in almost like in a pipe. So it is wrong to think that when you renaturalize, you can't introduce new land uses or do mixed uses. Here is a creative way of thinking about it, without leaving a huge footprint of building and built areas, right? So this is one way of thinking of introducing land use. So as I'm wrapping up these strategies in the Hampshire Park, certain things come out of this, and this is how they define their process. And I think that we can really benefit from learning about these, because we have been pressuring certain circles to say, well, environmental planning, river edge planning requires statutory planning instruments, which means that they have to be legal, they have to be forced, they cannot be just optional, or you cannot just say you can do this, but you cannot, because the development mind will always go for the, less risky, less costly and all of that. But statutory planning instruments require certain goals to be met. So, and here in an Hampshire model, as I told you earlier, the statutory part is quite serious and strong. And then they also do not rule out the informal planning instruments, and they say they actually come and lie from the desire of those involved in them to create change. So communities, cooperatives are of vital importance, but it's first the statutory planning instruments, because communities cannot bring those, most of them by themselves. It has to be state level, even federal level, and then you kind of give room for informal planning instruments or community-based planning instruments underneath that. So I think in that way, the success of this project shows that you can have nested planning instruments in the same system. Another thing, and again, going back to my earlier comment about the corridor versus a system, is the way they define their system dynamics of the master plan. I mean, it's hardly, I've never seen it actually in the United States, a master plan that has a kind of a strategy page like this, right? It is a systems thinking diagram. It's a lot of feedback loops. It looks messy. I say looks in quotation. It is not as straightforward as a linear architecture, right, of a flow chart. But what we see here is they actually are saying there are so many overlaps that they show in different colors, from economy to ecology, and we are looking at them as nested systems. So if we stick to the corridor approach, we see planning as a linear trajectory. And then we see charts and we see flow charts. But if we look at it maybe more systematically, then we have to update our understanding of how we convey information and master plan. And this basically chart to me shows the reflection of that approach to planning. And we saw similar things to that during the pandemic. If you look at any white paper or an executive report from worldly international agencies that came out during the pandemic, they all start with systems thinking. It's something that brought the systems thinking back into the picture, the crisis of the pandemic, because everything collapsed like domino, right? Stones, because there's kind of cascading effects of things. If one thing is affected, the supply chain is affected. If transportation is affected, food security is affected. So it's no surprise to see basically systems thinking coming back during times of crises. And here it's more proactive, saying before the crisis, let's start structuring our thinking around this. A second, less visual and more textual thing that I will be showing quickly is river contracts. That's also a tool that's been used in EU countries. It's been popular, I would say, in the past 2 decades, and mostly popular in countries like Italy, Switzerland, France, Spain. But it's making waves and more and more important, especially with climate change discussions. And it is a public-private spatial planning tool. It is a contract basically, and it's an environmental management tool. And here in this code, it says from bottom up. And then it creates all these coalitions between different communities along a river system to achieve similar goals. Let's see what this is. The rivers contract is a tool that integrates the interventions of environmental protection with needs of local productive development and fruition. So it's a regional tool. And I think this could be probably the equivalent of that in the US system would be a state level tool. If you remember the initial visual I showed you with the Illinois River system, how Chicago is actually feeding into that, and that feeds into Mississippi. Basically, here we can talk about a river contract along Illinois River all the way into Chicago River. So what does it do? It seeks the active involvement of local communities, essential for searching for solutions based on integrated policies. And they started in French and Belgian river corridors, now spreading widely actually in Italian river in cities. Basically, it's a process of negotiated governance to restore the eco-landscape of the river basins through multi-sector actions. That's the key word here. Again, a cross-sectional and a sectoral approach. Its aim is to consolidate the governance within the full basin. Again, here the system comes off as a basin. And as Adam was saying, we work with watersheds. Here, maybe in this case, we could be multiple watersheds that are involved in the system. But it's never just the one single river. It's the full basin, where actions to lower hydraulic risks are integrated with the protection and valorization of the river. And I think valorization is also another keyword here, is the values we attribute to the river systems, and is quite closely linked to how we develop them and how we protect them. So values aspect is mostly is something that's also in the molding, especially with climate change. And we call this epoch or the era as the Anthropocene, right? Humans' influence on the environment is huge. So how do you go back to the values of the river, its own values? And I'll come back to that in a minute. So how does it work? They construct and animate a network define tools and rules along the river system, build a vision and prioritize shared objectives. Then they are each part of this agreement, each actor is, let's say it could be cities as actors, they have to execute their own part of the agreement. So basically it's a binding protocol. And right now, like as this slide says, so many regions in Italy, and this is just an example of the 16 initiatives, are doing this cross-river, cross-sectoral contracts. In one case, like Tordino River contract, it involves 17 municipalities. So again, as Adam was showing in his part of the presentation, like it's not just the Chicago proper or like Chicago land or a metro that we are dealing with. We can actually include other places, other towns, other cities that are outside of this jurisdiction to have a better understanding of the system. So here that they are doing that. And in this case, in different rivers, they have different numbers of municipalities, and provinces also put in funding, and private sector puts in funding. So it's then a kind of a coalition of public and private partnership. There is a legal basis for that. And this is, again, I'm coming back to this emphasis on statutory. We need to have that in this part of the world so that we can actually really achieve meaningful change. And what they do here is they basically have statutory legal basis from different directives and EU level legislation. It all starts with the EU level and then trickles down to country level, and then from country level to region level as so. So the scaling of this legislative approach is quite important for us. So maybe our partners should go to the federal level to ask for this type of a kind of a change in approach. So we might be partnering up with different levels of governance, and that's basically showing that the river contract approach here is showing that. And then all the way to local code, the bottom of the slide shows that. When it trickles down to the cities, it goes all the way down to code of cultural and landscape heritage to a certain city or environmental legislation of a certain city. But again, it has to be consistent throughout the system. And the urban code, as you say here, as you see here, has to basically incorporate some of the goals of the river contracts. Well, what it achieved so far is landscape planning into water planning, which results in overlay zones in master plans. It is also creating contact between rural and urban. So we tend to focus only on urban, but rural interface also, or countryside, or some non-urban regions also come in contact with these rivers. They also can extend the river zones beyond setback areas. This is something that we defend so vehemently all the time. Like it has to be more than 30 feet back, right? 30 feet is nothing to kind of realize these shared goals between different coalition members. So here the contract basically in this example can expand our setback areas, river boundaries where necessarily, especially important for also the internal urban street system. So you might think that it's only the edge of it, but there is a program in the city of Essen in, again, the Amsterdam Valley, which is called Streets on the River. It's basically right of way that meets the river edge, and all those streets that end up in the river edge have also a different type of a standing and application of that. So rethink the entire urban matrix through the lens of a river identity. I'm not going to go through that. It's a lot of text, but I just wanted to highlight that basically this tool of the river contract starts with a lot of law and code writing here, as you can see on this side. And then this example is from Italy. It trickles down to the regional landscape plans. So any type of regional plans. Also, we don't have that many of them because regions that are not recognized as independent statutory entities in most places. Oregon Metro is an interesting outlier here. But in the European case, it's provinces, regions, and then from there you go to the planning tools, either protected area plans, river contract tools, and all the way trickling down to urban codes. So it's a hierarchical system of codes in the EU level, reaching all the way into the municipalities and river zones. as I am finalizing it, I thought this was something that I cannot really leave out before closing up, is that as we are facing climate crisis, this report came out in February, and this is a pretty, I would say, grim chart where it shows that we are inflicting the majority of environmental damage to the world. And one thing that came out from this floods discussion in Pakistan is they contribute so little to the environmental damage, but also bear the brunt of the environmental change. So how can we reconceptualize this globally so that countries who contributed more to environmental damage have more responsibility in shaping some of these policies? So I think that's a pretty also accurate and future remark about that. And as with that, a new movement, it's actually not a new movement, but it has been re-emerging and reappearing in different circles, is rights of nature movement gaining traction across the globe, and more of it actually we see in different countries. Here in the United States, we have a couple of examples of legal rights granted to natural entities and ecosystems, and especially this overlaps with indigenous rights in most places, but in others, not even with indigenous rights, it's just looking at nature as its own entity, and how can we basically give legal standing to natural entities so that they can be defended in courts and they can coexist with their intrinsic values, not just the values we attribute to them as resource, as amenity, as recreation, but they also come out as their own entities. So last slide, it's a very sad slide. You might have seen this in the news too very recently. This is a hunger stone. And for those of you who might not know what it is, these stones are laid during the times of drought in Central Europe with inscriptions for people to remind, for people to remember what happened back in the time. And this is an inscription that just recently came out on Elbe River. And it says, if you see me, weep or cry, because it means that the river levels are so low. So as we are having too much water and flooding in Pakistan, all across the Europe, we actually started seeing these inscriptions from 1890s, 1930s on hunger stones everywhere. And that makes us also think about the whole notion of how do we approach nature, how do we approach planning in nature, and how do you valorize some of these quantities and qualities of these systems. I guess that's all. So we have a bit of time for discussion. Thank you for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. And so, yes, we have about 30 minutes till 1:30 for questions and discussion. And so this was such a rich presentation. I know people are probably like processing some of the initial thoughts. I know we did get an initial question in the chat while you were talking about sort of what experience do you have with people who've opposed river restoration? And someone was specifically talking about their own work in DuPage County about a dam removal project, but love to hear, you know, if you have comments about that, but also just any experience you've had with opposition to river restoration.
So can you repeat the question? So are they asking me where these oppositions are coming from?
I think they just want to know if you've had experience with opposition to river restoration, and they are here. They are working on a project for a dam removal in DuPage County.
All the time. I mean, I think that's more common than actually seeing integrated approaches to rivers. So that's the story everywhere in the world, is that opposition of restoring the natural riverbed or expanding it. I mean, even I'm from Turkey. Even in Turkey, there is a Black Sea highway that they built, and it keeps just exploding every year, and they keep asphalting it. I mean, they're doing the same thing over and over, but the rivers that feed into Black Sea region wants to actually move. So, but the government is not changing it. So there is a lot of opposition to these type of ideas about renaturalization and restoration. I think it's more common to see opposition than cooperation, to be honest. So I'm optimistic and happy to see that rights of nature is gaining traction. More and more initiatives looking at the basis or the base of this whole problem is gaining more traction. But if you leave it to just the political spheres, you hardly find any creative approaches to that in the policy and political spheres. Yeah, that's my sense of this.
Yeah, and I can add a little bit because we have, experience with that, of course, especially probably before my time, even more. I will say that. So before I've been with Friends about 3.5 years as a staff person, but I volunteered with Friends for about 5 years before that. And even in that short piece of Friends of the Chicago Rivers history, I've seen a very changing shift in the amount of opposition, because now when you see kind of the economic drive and the value of the river edge from developers, people see that now because they understand that it adds value to their development. When I volunteered maybe 10-ish years ago, it was a much more difficult conversation about, can you please add some trees to the edge of your river? Now people come to the table and they get it, right? They're like, we need to do that because it's going to make our development more attractive. So there's been a big shift and it's much easier now, but there still is opposition. And I think one thing we try to do is really expand the definition of costs and benefits. I think there's often a very kind of narrow definition that's about kind of the economic cost and the economic benefit, but there's also other real costs associated with increasing stormwater, increasing pollution. All those things cost money in the end because there's additional damage, there's additional things that have to be cleaned up. And then there's also additional benefits that don't often get quantified from having a more ecological approach and having a restored and clean river system. And that includes a wide range of things, from air quality improvements and the public health benefits of having access to nature for communities, and the many, many, many other things that we think about. And capturing kind of all those costs and benefits and considering them in your decision, I think helps connect people to something in their life that they want. A lot of people want recreation and other things, so it helps kind of broaden the conversation instead of it just being about one issue.
I agree. I mean, there is this fantastic book called Feral by George Monbiot. He's one of the environmental writers of The Guardian regularly, and he's a British scholar. And this book is all about like how when they increased the population of wolves in the ecosystem around the rivers, they actually saw also river ecosystem flourishing. So because of the predators, the predator effect on certain invasive other species that are overpopulated, that are creating a lot of issues with the fauna and flora of the river system. So I would say that there are so many unexpected cascading effects of this. So it's never just about the edge or just about foliage or creating preserve areas, but it's also animals have a play in this, birds have cross-pollination, all of that actually work together. That's why it's a system rather than just a linear silo of things.
Yeah, that's really rich for us to be thinking about for our own city and to keep the conversation going. Kind of building off that in a different angle, when you were talking about the industrial repurposing, someone said, could you discuss a little bit more about the economics of repurposing? It seems obvious that that's a big factor, such as reusing instead of demolishing these sites. But do you have any insight on the economics of the repurposing?
I mean, definitely, if you look at just numbers, yes, it's easier to remove them and clean up and prepare it for new development. And then the revenues you would generate from potentially new development on that land could, offset some of the earlier costs. So all of this is something, but I think it's more about, you can't convince people just on that. Again, it requires long-term, long-range thinking. So if you say to people, if you build new development on this land and clean up, you might run into a problem of flooding in the future, stormwater, this and that, because they don't have it, they will not see it and they don't believe in it, right? I have this funny anecdote I heard from someone that someone working on these issues, both at condo in Miami, on the beach, right? And in Miami, it's sinking. And they asked him, like, why are you buying a condo in a place that's so ecologically vulnerable? And he said, I'm 70, I won't see it in my lifetime, so I just want to enjoy the beach. And that's the kind of thinking that probably will taint us all, seeing that how much of it are really going to knock on our doors. And you can't convince policymakers about this unless you overlap your proposal with a crisis, right? New York gained some traction in 2012 because of Sandy. Sandy caused so much damage. Immediately, Obama rolled out funding, and then all of these renaturalization processes on Hudson River, south part of Manhattan, parts of Brooklyn, and New Jersey Meadowlands. These were all like sites to consider. But this is because it overlapped with an environmental crisis. If it was in the regular business as usual days, people would not see the benefits of rolling out, millions of dollars of funding just to research and build up coalitions. So I think that's the kind of short-sighted, our short-sightedness as human beings versus long-range benefits. And that's why it's legal standing and statutory laws. I mean, they are important because you can't otherwise convince people to do it voluntarily. And the reason why Amsterdam Park, an example like Amsterdam Park came to be, is because of its, again, statutory planning from the top. So although we don't like top-down planning, in especially legal framing, we might need that. And because if we leave it just to the market and the negotiation between cities and developers, we might end up with a casino. And then the kind of that's just funny to say. Yeah, I mean, your North Branch Park, a beautiful park project, right, would run into obstacles and all of these things about, well, would we really need that? And so I think we also have to creatively think about the mixture of federal level involvement and local level involvement again. Most of the environmental traction that happened in this country in the 70s were through landmark laws of, clean air, clean water, wetlands law, right? So we might need another nudge or push in that direction for climate change. That's why it's also important to think of it globally, because as Pakistan is saying, we're not damaging the environment as much as you do in the United States. Why do we have such horrid floods here? So it's a kind of a systems effect, right? So that's why you cannot think of it outside of the systems thinking. Maybe I'm answering your question more conceptually about post-industrial areas, but I think what I saw in Germany, and if you are German, I think some people are in the audience, you would know that in the long range, the kind of benefits of turning an entire region like that a hub for a destination for internal tourism creates a lot of economic benefits too. So it depends on how you define revenue, and if you have time to invest in a long range, long phase plan. I mean, the only example I know of recently is the Fresh Kills Park in New York on Staten Island. It's a 30-year plan. They phased it out like the Amsterdam Park. They closed off the landfills, minimum human interaction, and it's the Parks District who is doing that. And it's a huge site on Staten Island. And yes, it's Fresh Kills. And if you look at it, they have several sections of development. And each part of or phase of the development, you can add a human dimension to it. So first you only can walk, and the second phase you can walk, bike, and canoe. So it is not geared towards the comfort of human beings saying, okay, let's prepare that immediately, create a recreational area. But they say, no, nature needs its own course of renaturalization. Let's respect that and add human beings as we go along. And I think we are also most of the time victim to our very anthropocentric thinking that we are so important. And that's why I feel optimistic about rights of nature, because that will also stir the discussion into different direction. It's like, where are we in this whole system? Are we the priority, or like, how can we do it else? Else.
No, that's really rich. And I feel like we need to have a moment here to maybe talk a little bit about the casino. And Adam, I don't know if you have any other comments. And then also, Sabine, if you wanted to talk, I mean, you just said a lot of great things about how we look at that, but also if you want to get dialogue going.
I would be happy to hear about the casino too. Adam and Juanita, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit. So we, of course, like anything that happens along the river that's that significant, we tracked it very closely throughout the whole process from the very beginning when the sites were being considered. We did when they were talking about different areas of the city, when they were at that stage, like where should it be, what sites, we did come out formally against the concept of a river edge casino, because we just thought that if you would think about like our vision for the river and our mission, that isn't the ideal use that we would envision. But as things go, you know, with the city, it pushed ahead and it got narrowed down, and we ended up with a river edge casino site in the end. So at this stage, what we've done, we have met with the team, the development team that's working on the casino. And some of the things that we really talked to them about is if this is going to be a river edge casino in Chicago, it's such an important location and it's one of these few remaining large scale river edge sites. It needs to be a different kind of casino. It can't be cookie cutter, you know, Las Vegas, plop it down, ignore the context of the river edge sensitivity. So we think it's really important that they consider its unique location. And then some of our concerns around with a casino use in particular is that entertainment aspect of it, which is great to have activity and be lively. It's great, but the river should not be treated as just kind of an entertainment zone, that it's more than that, that really, we've been long supported by all kinds of city plans envisioning that the river's focus really should be as a natural recreational corridor and not be over commercialized, which doesn't speak to the goal that's documented in all of the city plans and ordinances that the river is a public place. And so we expressed a lot of concerns around, you know, because there's lots of ideas around different rentals and party places and things, but is that really going to be welcoming to somebody who, from the general public, who just wants to visit the river edge, who wants to drop in a kayak? Can they just show up there and be on that place like as is intended in the city ordinance with the river? So we talked about that, and then along the lines of being, you know, thinking really creatively how a casino can fit into the context of the river edge is thinking really creatively about sustainability strategies and biodiversity. So maximizing green roofs and thinking about sensitivities because the river is a migratory corridor, thinking about bird-friendly design for the facades and different landscape strategies for the river edge that really support everyone's vision of this blue-green corridor. So those are the kinds of things that we're advocating for now.
I would say that really Adam has said it all. But I would just add, you know, even the North Branch Park and Preserve concept we think is even more important if we're going to also add a casino and hard edges along the river in that location, right? And we have neighbors across the way from the casino site at the River North Residents Association who are very concerned about the overuse of their very small park there than by, you know, a large number of folks maybe coming to the area because of casino, while the city is not creating enough additional, or we're not requiring enough additional green space to go with that development. So again, even more call for a large green space in that area up the river in the form of the North Branch Park and Preserves. And one of the challenges there is that some of the folks thinking about that work are only thinking about it in comparison to other sites along the river in terms of whether it's equitable to have that green space, that North Branch Park and Preserve investment there. But we think it's really important in the context of these other things that are happening along the river that are supposed to bring the public together to the river, but they're only prioritizing bringing them together for revenue generating activities for the private sector, right? Not thinking about how important that space should be for the public to come in and commune with nature and enjoy that space, the natural values of it. So
Thank you for that. And it doesn't even think about this idea that Şevin raised of like thinking of the river as its own entity with legal standing, right, within all of this as well. There also was a question which takes on a little bit different tact, but I think connects with some of important theme of your presentation, which was about the flow rate of the river and sort of the purification system that you shared that was used in Germany. Is there a minimum rate to make the in-stream purification systems work, or how would that impact those models?
I did not see a minimum rate in the Flussbad example. I mean, it would be subject to testing, right? So you would have to pilot this, like Wild Mile did with their project. You have to, test pilot a section of it to see the rate. But what they were suggesting there is, if you set up a system of a kind of a stage system of different plantations that would purify water, you eventually would have filtered water for people. And it's a canal similar to parts of the Chicago River. It's a canal, an industrial canal in that part of the Spray River. And I don't think that they have a huge rate of flow there. It rather looks like as a kind of a sedentary leg of the entire river system. I'm not sure about the actual data, but I think regardless of that, even if we can't swim it, and if it doesn't purify it to the end that it's drinkable water, and that's like kind of expectation is too high maybe, but the idea that you can actually do that as floating beds, and this is something that MWRD is also, Metropolitan Water Reclamation District, is also thinking about, like they have a special name for that, linear streams, I believe. Which is basically like linear patches of habitat attached to the edge of the river that kind of creates and regulates its own mechanisms of purification, reproduction, and all of that. And I think that's just important to see that it's not just beyond the banks of the river. I mean, of course, we have to have the navigability issue here, right? The Army Corps would require it. But at the same time, I heard that Army Corps was the obstacle mover in the Wild Mile project. So that's what I think that, is just, if you want to push forward, sometimes those agencies and federal entities that you might think as would be like obstacles to your projects might think otherwise. So there is a question about that actually from Amy, is like who we should be talking to. And I think, again, you all are doing great job, Friends of the Park, Friends of the River, and all other coalitions, North Branch, Watershed, like Council, and they're all doing great jobs in their own way. But I think you need support too. That's what I understand in kind of bringing all your visions together, right? So who would be the people to persuade? I think your local alderman, then your congressman, in federal level. These are thinking that the Sandy Rebuilt by Design project of Sandy was an Obama initiative that came from HUD, is showing that federal government can engage. Is an example of that. It can engage, it can provide funding, and there are all these green blue infrastructure funds that are coming from Biden administration, and they're up for debate. Like, they don't know what the context of it is. They just define it, but you can actually go and pursue people saying like, this is how we see it. They all want to solve the climate debacle, right? Or at least become more resilient to that. So I think this is a great time to do such advocacy. It just might start with local level, but your allies might be even in the higher levels. So, and especially with statutory planning, that's something that, because the EU system is different, all countries have different constitutions and different parliamentary systems, it might not directly translate to the US. But I think if the movement of rights of nature gains more traction in the next 5 years, 10 years, and what happens if the Chicago River becomes a legal entity? Are you going to reverse all the past decisions? Who's going to defend rivers' rights? Those are the questions that comes like applicability questions. But I think this is a good time to start that. And it's when it comes to brownfields, EPA has brownfield redevelopment projects, right? Maybe their scope is too narrow, and then there's room for also expanding the narrow of brownfield sites that EPA is granting funding to. The technical assistance grants that EPA has been handing out is huge to communities. So that could be one way of also looking at this.
That's so helpful for us to just be thinking about, like, it is a big, like, we need to have all these interconnected things, as you're talking about the cascading effects. And I'll pitch, you know, some things that Friends of the Parks is working on. One thing we're hoping to do is pull together park activists and PAC leaders and others throughout the city to help develop questionnaires for our municipal elections that are upcoming, to ask about these questions around our green spaces, around our river, as leaders in the community, and to get actual, you know, we don't always ask those questions of elected officials, or maybe we ask something about climate change broadly, but really getting in, you know, these questions about the casino development, what do we want to see along the river? And wanting to work with communities to determine what's most important where you live, to ask those running for mayor for the whole city, and also the alder folks, especially with so many transitions in our local government. This is going to be an interesting time. And so just to be asking those questions and engaging. But I would also say we're doing some of our work with the confined disposal facility on the Calumet River, right? We're directly engaging with some of the federal agencies and some of the different policies that different agencies hold and how they implement things, right? That's what's allowing the Army Corps to say, we still need to have this CDF that's storing toxic dredge. And I see in the short term, they need a place for those materials to go. And they are like, we already have this place, so we want to keep it there. But they're not thinking about how does that impact the river and the lake and the water long term. And we want to influence them, especially as they also help with our lakeshore erosion. And you know, as they were a barrier or an opponent at different points with Wild Mile. So wanting to help change their rules, right? Like, and knowing that different agencies have different perspectives, and maybe we need to connect with federal government in creative ways too, like you mentioning HUD working with what happened in New York. So just a little plug for some of our work. I see that the time we're at 1:26. I would love to invite any last comments from our speaker today, and then we'll do some quick announcements and follow up.
I really enjoyed this, so thank you for inviting me. I know some of these are big ideas, you would need to think on them, but I think we can actually digest it down to smaller pieces in time, and the time is right for that. So going back to the earlier comment about advocacy, and I think this is the time to do the advocacy, to get into the agendas of people. And so I'm optimistic on that front, I would say.
Great. We're so thankful for having you with us today.
Thank you.
It's our honor.
It was an honor for me too. And Walter Netsch actually built, designed the UIC campus, right? So I was thinking this is a great overlap.
Yes.
So, yes.
And I just wanted to add, when I go to the National City Parks Alliance conferences, I often hear them talking about things that are happening globally that we're not hearing enough about here in Chicago. And so I'm so thankful for you bringing international perspectives to some of these things, so that we can imagine that others are already doing this. It's not like so impossible. There is actually leadership around these things elsewhere, and we really just have to encourage our leadership here in those directions.
Exactly. So there are precedents, right? Yeah.
Yep. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Real quick, I can share a couple announcements from Friends of the Parks, and then I'll invite Adam to share from Friends of the Chicago River. We've dropped in the chat the link to the recording for today, which we'll also email to those who've attended. We have another in-person sort of interactive Netsch lecture coming up at the end of the month on September 24th. There's a chance to have a tour of rock drawings along the lake at Foster Beach. So we've dropped the link for that. That's limited to 20 people because of being able to hear and move together as a group to actually see those drawings. So I'd love to have you come if you're interested in that. It'll be at 10 a.m. on September 24th. We also on the September 17th are helping to promote a family day with free rock climbing at Steelworkers Park. So if you haven't been out to the park, they have a rock climbing wall, and the park district is offering climbing free that day. We've dropped in the phone number to call to register, so they make sure to have enough equipment for all the free rock climbers during that time. And also on September 24th, if you're on the south side of the city at Schaefer Park, we'll be having a wellness fair in conjunction with the Urban Growers Collective and their weekly farmers market. that happens on that site. So really excited. And I'll throw it over to Adam for some announcements from the Friends of the Chicago River.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks to everyone and for joining us. And just a couple of things, if you're interested in getting out on the water, check out Friends of the Chicago River's website at chicagoriver.org. Our events page, we have canoe programs almost every weekend through the fall here. So there's always ways to get out there. And then if you want a more restful way to get out on the water, on October 13th, we have our autumn cruise, which benefits the Bridge House Museum on the Riverwalk. And that's just a really fun event on a boat on the river on the South Branch, something fun to go to. And then one thing I just wanted to give a heads up of, we are with the River Ecology and Governance Task Force having ongoing conversations about these kind of regulatory issues and land use issues. And we will be planning a couple of engagement activities coming up later in September and October about the South Branch and Bubbly Creek, a couple of opportunity sites in that area. And we'll be working with the city and other partners on that engagement. So you might just want to keep an eye out for that if you're interested in kind of having this type of conversation about more specific sites. We'd love to have you.
Thank you for that. And my final note is, again, thank you for being a wonderful audience today. If you'd like to connect with Adam and myself, I've dropped our contact information into the chat box, as well as the websites of all the things we've been talking about today. So please reach out with us if you'd like to get more involved. And thank you so much for joining us today for this wonderful Netsch lecture.
Thank you.